Okay, this should be the last section on chapter 14. I tried to divide it into subtopics. So metabolism would be the last subtopic of this chapter. The idea of metabolism is different from what we tend to think of metabolism. Typically, day to day, you might say, oh, I used to have such a fast metabolism, I could eat a whole pizza a day and I would never gain a pound, and now I have 2 slices and it goes right to my hips, or something like that. That idea of metabolism is actually only half of what metabolism actually is. Metabolism is all of the chemical reactions in the body. So this is the building reactions as well as the breaking reactions. Most of the reactions in our body are catalyzed or sped up by enzymes or combinations of enzymes with vitamins. They can be special electron carrier enzymes like NADH and FADH that we'll talk about, that carry a hydrogen ion. These include synthesis or anabolic reactions or catabolic reactions, which are decomposition reactions, the breaking reactions. So this animation here goes through metabolism. Let's talk about anabolic reactions. Anabolic reactions are when simple organic molecules are combined to make more complex ones. Anabolic reactions are building reactions. These reactions need energy. The energy is generated from splitting ATP into ADP plus P. To generate ATP, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are broken down into glucose. Glucose is then used to generate ATP. Neurons, red blood cells, will only use glucose to generate ATP. Other body cells, like our cardiac cells, will actually use lipids and amino acids to generate ATP when glucose is not available. Here you can see, I believe I drew a diagram such as this very early on in the semester. This is the idea of creating ATP. So you have simple molecules such as glucose, amino acids, glycerol fatty acids. These molecules are broken down to make ATP. Complex molecules such as glycogen, proteins, and triglycerides can then be made, and then catabolic reactions, breaking these complex molecules down, forming ATP is also going to create these simple molecules. So let's talk about the opposite, those catabolic reactions. These are complex organic molecules being broken down into simpler ones. So this would be like digestion. These reactions release energy and store it in the form of ATP. Only 40% of the energy from the food that we eat is actually captured as ATP. The rest of it is generated or released as heat, rather. That's why we have this kind of internal furnace creating lots of warmth in our body. Let's talk about carbohydrate catabolism, or the breakdown and digestion of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are catabolized into monosaccharides or simple sugars. Ultimately, they're converted into glucose. If the cell requires ATP, glucose is oxidized. Oxidation is when the electrons are removed. So the excess glucose is then stored as glycogen in the liver and muscle cells, and if enough glycogen stores are present, the liver is going to convert excess glucose into triglycerides for storage in the adipose tissue. The triglycerides can then be converted back into glucose if needed. This animation here goes through carbohydrate metabolism. So let's talk about cellular respiration. The first process in cellular respiration is glycolysis. It's going to generate 2 ATP. Glycolysis is when that molecule of glucose is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Acetyl coenzyme A, also called acetyl-CoA, is formed, and then the Krebs cycle is performed. The Krebs cycle is going to generate ATP, as well as some energy holding molecules called NADH and FADH. NADH and FADH will enter the electron transport chain, which is also known as oxidative phosphorylation, where 32 ATP can be generated. So each glucose molecule that goes through this process is going to generate 36 ATP molecules. Here's the whole process in a nutshell. That glucose molecule enters the cell, and in doing so, this process of glycolysis happens. It does not require any oxygen. It's an anaerobic process. It happens immediately. The glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid. This process yields 2 ATP. The 2 pyruvic acid molecules will enter the mitochondria. The mitochondria are going to perform a cycle called the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle will release 2 ATP molecules for energy, as well as NADH and FADH. NADH and FADH are going to travel to another part of the mitochondria where the electron transport chain will take place. The hydrogen atoms on the NADH and FADH are going to donate electrons, which are going to basically be passed down this kind of hot potato-like pathway called oxidative phosphorylation, and this process generates ATP, 32 to 34 ATP to be exact. At the end of oxidative phosphorylation, oxygen has to be present. If oxygen is not present, none of this will happen. Krebs cycle will not happen, oxidative phosphorylation will not happen. So if oxygen is present, if all of these things took place, this hydrogen ions that were kind of passed down this oxidative phosphorylation chain will join with oxygen to form water. Water is a byproduct, ATP is a byproduct, carbon dioxide is also a byproduct or waste product of metabolism, cellular respiration. So, the anaerobic process in cellular respiration, as I mentioned, is glycolysis. That's the piece that does not require oxygen. That's when the glucose molecule comes in the cytoplasm, it's converted into 2 pyruvic acid molecules, it yields 2 ATP molecules. Aerobic processes include the formation of acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA will enter the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle will produce FADH and NADH. FADH and NADH will go into oxidative phosphorylation. And the final electron acceptor in oxidative phosphorylation is oxygen to create water. All of these aerobic processes will not occur if oxygen is not present. So, how is glucose made when there's not enough in the diet? So say you go on a low carbohydrate diet. One of the first processes that will start in your body is called glycogenolysis. This is breaking down the glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose, into glucose. So glycogen is kind of like picking up a whole bunch of glucose molecules and packing them up in a nice little box. And when your blood glucose levels are low, you break out the box of glycogen and start picking off the pieces of glucose and tossing it back into your blood. Gluconeogenesis is the synthesis of glucose from amino acids, glycerol, pyruvic acid, lactic acid. It's basically the reverse of glycolysis. So your body will say, whoa, we don't have enough glucose floating around, we need to make some. Let's start breaking down our muscles, which are made of lots of protein, to get amino acids so that we can have some more glucose. Ultimately, glycogen is going to be broken down first. Once you use up all your glycogen stores, then your body will start metabolizing all of the fats. The last resort is proteins. Your body does not like to use proteins for energy or proteins to make glucose because there's lots of harmful byproducts when you do protein metabolism. So here's the overall process. You can see glycogen, lactic acid, and certain amino acids can all become pyruvic acid, which can then be converted into glucose. Triglycerides can be converted, broken down into glycerol, which can be converted into a substrate, which can be converted into glucose. Fatty acids undergo a different process that we'll look at in a little bit. So lipid catabolism, which is also known as lipolysis or lipolysis, this is going to occur only in the muscle cells, the liver cells, and fat cells. So this is where lipids are stored. The triglycerides, which are the stored form of fat, are split into glycerol and 3 fatty acids. The glycerol is converted into G3P, which is an intermediate. G3P is then converted through gluconeogenesis into glucose. It can also be converted into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP then through cellular respiration. The fatty acids are converted into acetyl-CoA for cellular respiration. Sometimes they're converted into ketones to use as an energy source in other cells. Then they can be changed back into acetyl-CoA and metabolized through cellular respiration. I strongly urge you to make a flow chart of these types of events so that you can kind of trace their sequence. There's also epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol, which are neurotransmitters and or hormones that can stimulate lipolysis. The building of fats, lipid anabolism, lipogenesis, is performed if there's no needs for lipids to be used. Then they're going to be stored as triglycerides. So in other words, you're bringing lots and lots of glucose into your body. You're bringing lots and lots of fats into your body. You don't need to use them, so you're going to store them. The triglycerides can be created also from excess glucose using that same pathway. Insulin is the hormone that's going to stimulate this process called lipogenesis. So here you see lipid metabolism. You have the idea of certain amino acids being used to create acetyl-CoA going into the Krebs cycle. Glucose itself can be converted into pyruvic acid, acetyl-CoA, and enter the Krebs cycle. Triglycerides are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. The glycerol is converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is then converted into pyruvic acid, then converted into acetyl-CoA, then goes into the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. The breakdown of acetyl-CoA can yield ketone bodies. So in other words, with the breakdown of fatty acids, it's going to yield lots and lots of acetyl-CoA. Too much acetyl-CoA is going to form these structures called ketone bodies in the liver, and that can be harmful to your body cells. This animation here goes through lipid metabolism. Let's talk about lipoproteins. You've probably heard of these before and you didn't even know about it. Lipids, as you know, are hydrophobic, so they need to be transported in special water-soluble packages attached to a special protein, and we call them lipoproteins. We've mentioned chylomicrons before. They're made in the small intestine. They transport dietary lipids to adipose cells for storage. But there's also VLDLs, which are very low-density lipoproteins. These transport triglycerides from the liver to adipose for storage. They will eventually become LDLs after they deposit some of their triglycerides. There's LDLs, which carry 75% of the cholesterol in blood and deliver it to the body cells. These can lead to fatty plaques, which is why we sometimes call LDL the bad cholesterol. The high-density lipoproteins, or HDLs, are also known as the good cholesterol because what they do is they carry excess cholesterol from the body to the liver, and then the liver can get rid of it by forming bile crystals. So let's talk about protein catabolism. Ingested proteins and body proteins can be broken down into amino acids and absorbed by the small intestine. Amino acids cannot be stored, though. They can be used to make new proteins. They can be converted into glucose. They can be converted into triglycerides. They can be converted into ketones, or they could be catabolized to generate ATP. Amino acid uptake is stimulated by insulin-like growth factor and insulin itself. Amino acid groups are then removed through a process called deamination. It produces ammonia, which you may have heard of before, ammonia. Right? It's very toxic, so the liver wants to get rid of it. It converts that ammonia into urea. Urea is excreted in the urine. That's what gives urine its smell as well as its color. The remaining organic components from catabolism can then be used in cellular respiration in the Krebs cycle, in other words, to make ATP. But because ammonia is created as a byproduct of amino acid catabolism, your body really doesn't like to use amino acids for energy. This animation goes through the process of protein metabolism. So let's talk about how cells know whether or not they should catabolize or anabolize. The regulation of this is controlled by special enzymes, and it's going to be regulated by the metabolic processes, or products rather, through negative feedback, as well as hormone levels. Glucose 6-phosphate is a special molecule that's going to be metabolized to reform ATP, or it can be converted into other molecules as needed. Basically, the cell traps glucose by transferring a phosphate to glucose from ATP to make the glucose 6-phosphate, and then this G6P can then be reused as like an emergency energy reserve. There's also pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid can be used to create ATP. It can be converted to make amino acids or glucose as well. If oxygen is not available, that pyruvic acid is going to be converted into lactic acid. And then when oxygen is available, that lactic acid can then be converted back into pyruvic acid, which can enter the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. Acetyl-CoA is the product of pyruvic acid breakdown, fatty acid oxygenation, as well as the deamination of amino acids. It's metabolized in the Krebs cycle for ATP production. It can also be converted into ketones when the carbohydrates are not in sufficient quantities. Did I skip one? Nope. Okay. So let's talk about some pathologies here. Diabetes mellitus. This is elevated blood glucose. This is going to cause an increased urine flow, increased appetite, and poor circulation in the extremities. You've probably heard of these before, type 1 and type 2. Type 2 is when you have no insulin in the bloodstream. This is because your immune system has basically destroyed the beta cells of your pancreas, which are the cells that secrete insulin. Type 2 diabetes is when your cells are so tired of responding to glucose, they've become insensitive to it. This is the type that's associated with obesity. If you recall from our endocrine hormone chapter, when you're eating or bringing glucose into your body or even bringing lots of fatty acids into your body, insulin is secreted so that your cells can uptake the glucose and fatty acids. It will deposit them in glycogen or in adipose tissue, etc., doing lipogenesis. Well, your cells, after being told so many times to do this process over and over and over, are basically going to stop listening. So you will have normal or elevated, possibly, levels of insulin in the blood, but your body's cells are not going to respond to that insulin, even though it's there. And that's why type 2 can be very dangerous. It's associated with obesity. So when glucose, triglycerides, fatty acids, and amino acids are ingested, they're typically absorbed into the blood, but they do not enter the body cells. The concentration of those nutrients increase, which negatively impacts the kidney, peripheral circulation, respiration, nervous system activity, as well as vision. So insulin is key to pulling those nutrients out and getting them into the cells. Here you can see some overall effects of diabetes. Some of the prolonged effects included elevated glucagon and cortisol levels, which cause the liver to break down glycogen. The blood levels become elevated for glucose, glycerol, fatty acids, amino acids, and ketones. There's going to be glucose in the urine, increased urine flow, osmotic pressure, leading to capillary absorption. There's going to be loss of muscle mass with type 1 and type 2, loss of body fat in just type 1. You're going to have tissue dehydration, cold feeling in your hands and feet, possibly numbness, possibly soreness, possibly gangrene, vision problems associated with retinopathy as well as blindness. So all of those effects from diabetes. Diabetes type 1 treatments, this would be simple insulin injections. There's even an insulin pump now that you can get installed on your body, and it will just automatically, sense that your blood glucose levels are low and, stimulate the glycogen reserves to be used, or since the blood glucose levels are high, to stimulate insulin. Type 2 can be moderated through diet and exercise. It could use insulin injections, but usually it's just done through diet to control the blood glucose levels. Let's talk about obesity. Anytime when your body weight is over 20% of the acceptable standard is classified as obesity. If your body mass index BMI is greater than 30 kilograms per square meter. So you can go to various BMI calculators on the internet. I encourage you to do so to find out your BMI. You're at higher risk if you're obese for high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, pulmonary disease, diabetes, type 2, arthritis, varicose veins, gallbladder disease, breast, uterine, colon cancers as well. This chart here gives you an estimate of your BMI, so you can find your height on the side in feet and inches, and then your weight in pounds, and then kind of find out where you might be on the BMI scale. So obesity can be caused by genetic component, but it's also eating habits, a sedentary lifestyle, and social culture. It's ultimately caused by an imbalance between energy in and energy out. That's all what it comes down to, the amount of energy you're bringing into your body in the form of calories and the amount of energy that you're actually using. An increased caloric intake, but not changing the amount of energy that you're expending. So your body weight is going to increase. Your energy intake is made up of the food that you're bringing in and how well that food is being absorbed. The energy expenditure is related to what's called your basal metabolic rate, which is actually 65% of your energy expenditure. This is what your body would use even if all you did was lay on the couch all day. Your body is still using energy. Your body is still using calories just to keep you alive. Even, again, if all you did was lay on the couch all day and watch TV, 65% of your metabolism is still being upheld. Physical activity is going to count for about 30 to 35% of the energy expenditure. This could be anything from walking to check the mail to actually running a marathon, depending on how active you are. And then there's the thermic effect of food, which most of us don't think about, but the actual process of digesting food uses calories. Think about all those smooth muscles that have to contract. So 5 to 10% of your calorie intake is actually going to just digesting your food, which is kind of a win-win if you think about it. Talk about body weight regulation. There's special sensors within your body to help regulate this. Of course, some of us have started to ignore them. The fat tissues as well as the GI tract organs use nerves as well as hormones to send signals to the brain. The amount of fat tissue, the presence or absence of food in the GI tract are going to stimulate these sensors. Leptin is a hormone secreted by fat tissue. The more fat you have, the more hormone is in your blood. It's the primary signal for long-term regulation of body fat. Leptin is going to sense when lipogenesis is occurring and tell your brain, hey, we're starting to deposit all of this food onto our body as fat. We need to stop eating. Ghrelin is the hormone that's secreted by the stomach before the meal. This is going to stimulate food intake. Ghrelin is the little guy that says, I'm hungry, feed me. Kind of like a gremlin, so to speak. And then insulin, of course, which is going to stimulate lipogenesis as well. There's also special integrating systems within the hypothalamus, stimulating and suppressing the appetite. The hypothalamus, of course, being the big relay between the endocrine and nervous systems. The various effectors, including the neural and endocrine pathways to respond to the signals from the medulla oblongata. They can alter our feeding behavior as well as our energy metabolism. When the GI tract is empty, our parasympathetic nerves are going to inhibit the satiety center within the medulla oblongata. Ghrelin is going to signal to the hypothalamus appetite stimulating center and say, hey, we're hungry, our stomach is empty now. When the GI tract is full, the ghrelin levels fall. Sympathetic nerve signals satiety to stop eating, so that's when you say, woo, I've had enough. When those ghrelin levels fall and the sympathetic nerves stop sending their signals. There's also behavior therapy that can help with obesity treatment to change your lifestyle, increasing physical activity, right? Think about the Biggest Loser, right? Eliminating that binge or emotional eating that lots of us are suffering from. Monitor the caloric intake, monitor the frequency of meals, monitor snacking, monitor the types of foods that you're eating. All of those things are attributed to behavior therapy. There's also drug therapy. There's certain drugs that can target appetite suppression to target the leptin and suppress the ghrelin. They can target the absorption of fat in the small intestine. There are some treatments that you can take that will eliminate the absorption of fat so that the fat will just pass right through. There's also surgical interventions, which you may be familiar with as well. Gastric bypass becoming more and more common. It's irreversible, and that's where part of the stomach is removed so that you get that full feeling faster. There's also gastric banding, which is the reversible procedure. The band's placed around the stomach to reduce its size so that you feel full quicker, and then that band can ultimately be removed later if needed. Your body temperature is regulated by something called your basal metabolic rate. That's the rate at which heat energy is produced by your body, depending on how big you are. That can range between 12 and 1,800 calories a day. The larger person you are, typically males tend to have a higher BMR than females, again, because they tend to be larger. Notice 12 to 1,800 calories a day, they say you should be bringing in usually around 2,000, 2,200 calories for your diet. So this is right around what your body would just be burning to maintain life, right? This is that producing body heat, constantly produced from reactions in the body. It has to be removed from the body via sweat, as well as blood vessel dilations, etc., so that you can maintain that stable body temperature. The body temperature is a balance between heat loss and heat production. And there's several different processes that are going to cause heat loss. You'll probably be familiar with these: radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Let's look here at the idea of heat production. So as I mentioned, males have a higher basal metabolic rate than females. The sympathetic nervous system is going to increase the basal metabolic rate. Hormones like thyroid hormones, testosterone, and insulin are also going to increase the basal metabolic rate. Physical activity increases your basal metabolic rate. The thermic effect of food, in other words eating, is going to increase your basal metabolic rate. The basal metabolic rate is actually proportional to your body temperature. So in other words, the lower your body temperature is, the lower your basal metabolic rate is, and vice versa. Your basal metabolic rate is going to decrease with age. As we know, everything kind of slows down as you age. Sleep is going to also lower your basal metabolic rate. Poor nutrition is going to lower your BMR. And the BMR tends to be lower in the tropical areas of the world because you don't have to generate as much body heat in those areas because the sun is there to warm you up. So, some methods of heat loss, as I mentioned: evaporation. This is converting the liquid into a gas, and that's going to remove about 22% of the heat from our body. So that's the process of sweating. There's also conduction. This would be like water poured on a runner or a swimmer in the pool, actually transferring the heat from one area to another area, from the body to a liquid. There's also radiation, the transfer of heat between warm objects to cooler ones. So your body is constantly radiating heat to its surroundings. Think about huddling up close to one another at a football game, as our bodies are all radiating heat to generate a kind of a bubble of warmth around us. And then there's also convection. This is the transfer of heat by movement from areas of different temperature, like a fan blowing over you, removing heat by convection, or heat escaping from the top of your head through convection. All of this, of course, is regulated by negative feedback mechanisms. We looked at, I think, the same exact picture way back in Chapter 1, I believe. So you have some type of disruption to homeostasis where your body temperature is decreasing. That's going to trigger special receptors in the skin and hypothalamus. The hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland are going to stimulate the thyroid, stimulate the adrenal gland, cause vasoconstriction, release special hormones to increase metabolism, cause skeletal muscle shivering. Thyroid gland is going to secrete thyroid hormones to increase the basal metabolic rate. All of that's going to result in an increased body temperature to get us back to homeostasis. To decrease body temperature, you have sense receptors fired off in your skin and hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland are going to send out impulses to vasodilate, to sweat, and to have decreased thyroid hormone, all to decrease the body temperature. Let's talk about hypothermia. This is when your core body temperature is lower than 35 degrees Celsius, which is about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take a few tenths of a degree there. Negative feedback system can be active, but it's not able to compensate for heat loss because your heat loss is so rapid. The conditions that cause hypothermia would be cold stress, metabolic diseases, drugs, burns, as well as malnutrition. Symptoms of hypothermia include cold sensation, shivering, vasoconstriction, slowed heart rate, reduced BMR, coma, loss of spontaneous movement. Death can actually be a result from cardiac arrhythmias and cardiac arrest. A fever would be caused when your hypothalamic thermostat is reset to a higher temperature. This can be caused by bacterial viral infections, bacterial toxins, hyperthyroidism, tumors, immune reactions to vaccinations. Ultimately, when phagocytes fight infections, pyrogens, which are chemicals secreted by immune cells, they're released and they reset that hypothalamus to a higher temperature by releasing substances called prostaglandins. The higher temperature is going to discourage bacterial growth as well as viral growth. Too high temperatures can also be damaging, as of course we know. Treatment for fever are certain pain relievers that reduce prostaglandin production. Aspirin, Ray's syndrome may result if it's administered to children and teens. Acetaminophen, and ibuprofen as well. And that ends chapter 14.